Michael Vanen, and welcome back to Medieval Art. I'm Dr. Brian Keenan. Again, I'm here with Dave Lewis of Cinemillennials. This week in the episode The Eye, we had some clear references from lore and Legendarium, but we also had additional misdirects, redirects, and aspects of the show writing that are constantly causing us to debate or question our own assumptions about the show from start to finish. And we have one episode to go. So Dave, where should we go in this conversation? Because I know for myself, there were a number of tearjerker moments. The first in the series where I really felt the strongest emotional draw to some of the characters, but also some continued doubt and debate. So what's our first talking point today?
I think one of the best parts about this episode was Galadriel's full circle moment of her becoming her brother in relation to Theo's ideas and his struggle with the weight of guilt, and this idea about talking the darkness and the light. I think she really is finally becoming what a lot of people are complaining about, is that with her characters, that she's too hard-nosed, she's too focused on her mission and not realizing what she's actually become, which is fair. And I think she's finally becoming someone that's humbled, someone that's shocked that, yes, I was right, but I went the wrong way about it. And I think she sees the little inklings or the saplings of that within Theo. And she now realizes that this is who he could become, and it could lead to worse and worse things in the future.
It's wonderful the way she had that interaction. That was indeed one of those tearjerker moments where I finally felt that we're seeing a more rounded view of Galadriel. I admit that I actually have enjoyed her characterization thus far. I like seeing this real drive that she's had, both a familial connection and also a slow recognition of her own role in this sort of journey of perpetuating darkness and the search for light. And I think that is a struggle that the elves have across the board. And we saw that paralleled in another way with Elrond referring to himself as half elven, and referring to his own sort of journey in relation to seeing himself in relation to elves and so forth. But I think you're right to touch on that point about not shouldering so much of the burden that both she and Theo, I think, are feeling in response to the events that have transpired. At the same time, when we shift our view then across Middle-earth to the Dwarven story, we see another really touching moment of father and son, Durin the third and Durin the fourth, having their argument. We see Disa and Durin the fourth having a real sense of coming together to support the elves. And then that other really beautiful conversation with Elrond and Durin solidifying their friendship and recognizing what's at stake for both of them as worlds come to an end, as lifespans and friendships potentially part. So I think we've been given some really wonderful emergence of character over the course of these last 7 weeks.
Yeah, I know. I completely agree. We're getting a full arc. We're getting these people to be actual people rather than these high elven, made out of ebony, made out of ivory, this kind of thing that people often attribute these characters to be. Because yes, they are myths and legends. Yes, they are brilliant. Yes, they are great, but they need to start somewhere. And yes, we're getting their younger versions of themselves. So we're getting the growth of how they eventually get to be those myths and legends we love so much. And, we're getting conversations that are harder and harder for these characters to look into a mirror, if you will, with Galadriel, with Elrond, where they're finally owning who they actually are and what's happening to them, what happened to them in the past, and how they can use what happened to them in the past for the future, whether it be following certain leaders or distrusting others.
I think you're absolutely right. I'm glad if we stick to that mirror point about Galadriel, we heard references in previous episodes about mirrors. And in this episode, Galadriel has a number of important confessions to Theo, referring when he asks if she's lost anyone to orcs. And she refers to her brother Finrod. It was nice to hear his name, but then
Mhm.
also to Celeborn. That was a real eye-opening moment. I'm glad that we've heard his name, but there's this assumption in her mind that he's dead. Wow. I mean, I don't think he can be, given what we know from the Peter Jackson trilogy and what we know about the Celeborn storyline, but that's another instance of these characters' story arcs being misdirected somehow. How did you feel about that reference to Celeborn?
Oh yeah, I mean, totally. I knew going into it that I was like, wow, really? That's interesting. But then I said, wait a second, there's a lot of things within this story within the last 6 episodes, 7 episodes that I think everybody is starting to get a little tricked. I think there's a lot of red herrings throughout the show, whether it be the stranger, whether it be Halbrand, the roots of Hithyglir. I think there's a lot of things here that we are, as an audience that knows and loves and respects this lore, that we think that we have this kind of prideful energy like the Numenorians. But like the Numenorians, it could lean to our downfall. A lot of people think that we are we are in the ilk of Galadriel, Elrond, and Gil-Galad, in that we can detect evil and reject it right away. But that's where a lot of things get very scary, because we think that we have these events in our head, but do we actually? Do we think that these things are real? Do they think, it's all about perception. And I think the showrunners love the lore so much that they know the audience and they know these characters so well that they're constantly twisting and turning with our minds. So I think there's a lot of things here that we might think is true when it's actually a lie.
Agree. And that would be the perfect setup. I mean, in that regard, the showrunners are themselves the Anatar figure that are deceiving us as viewers. And that's the other beautiful thing, is that we get these constant references. We heard another reference this week to Aule. We also heard in that dialogue between Miriel and Galadriel, where Miriel says, don't pity our enemies, for they don't know what they've awoken in us. And she refers to her father. I was expecting a reference to Tar Palantir, but she refers to him as Insiladun. She gives his Anduniac name. There's some very clear choices in the writing, in the naming, in the developing of the story that I think will continue to play out. And that will be the most exciting bits to look back on, I think, when we rewatch the series and as we go into the final episode, to think, now we have the bigger picture. And I think we're going to be left with even more unknowns going into the end. So we can't forget the Harfoots and their storyline in this episode. And we have to also return to the dwarves. So if we start with the dwarves, we have our reference to the Balrog. It felt to me a little bit too soon. I'm hoping that we don't see the fall of the dwarves this early on in the storyline. But how did you feel about the way the dwarvish tales are being developed in the series?
I kind of agree with you. I think that there is a lot of heart and a lot of faith and fidelity between the two characters that we're seeing a lot of, whether actually not two, multiple characters, where we're getting Elrond, we're getting Disa and Durin. We're getting a lot of faith and fidelity, and also a lot of breaking of those oaths and faiths and fidelities, because I think there is something deeper here. When you see Disa and Durin talking, saying it's ours, this is our mithril, this is our power, this is the way that we can do it. It almost seems like it's like kind of Game of Thrones-ish, where they're trying to maybe have Durin the Third abdicate or force him out of the throne or something like that. So I thought that was interesting. But maybe this delving too deep is starting to crumble. It's starting to fall into place. And I think it's interesting. However, I think what's more interesting is that this idea of mithril being one of the Silmarils are they trying to connect it to the Silmarils and all the pain and anger and horrible wrath that they created? Or are we getting something a little bit closer to the dwarves and how it's more focused on them? So I think it's interesting to see where we're going to go with these characters, and how, yes, they're loving and joyful and happy, but are we getting a little bit of an underbelly here?
I agree. And I think that's the entire connection to the Silmarils within this series is a surprise to me. I didn't know how much we'd get. And I hope that we'll see this, the story of the roots of Hithyglir play out even more, hopefully as a deception point.
Yes.
And then in terms of our last moment together with the stranger and his story with the Harfoots, we see that they're now separated and the Harfoots are going searching for them again. It feels like a Fellowship of the Ring moment where the four hobbits go off on their journey. I'm still very interested to see that character develop, whomever he is, and the cult of Morgoth, if that's who they are, or these followers, sorcerers, mystics, whomever they are. That's a storyline that I hope gets resolved, or at least furthered in our last episode.
No, I completely agree. I think we're definitely getting an Istari within the stranger, and to get even more of a cult of personality within Morgoth, within Sauron, it's going to be definitely something interesting that we haven't seen before, and something that will give us more nuance and maybe more gray area that Tolkien writes about that isn't presented in the popular ideas of Tolkien from Jackson's trilogy, as well as Rankin and Bass films and other cartoons that we've seen before.
Well, I know we have to say Namarie, but we can continue our